Hello, this is Unit 1, Lecture 2, the Progressive Era. This is Brutus, who wants to go out, but we will go out when we're done with this lecture. It's too hot to be out there now anyway. All right, can you go lay down for a while? Can you stop staring at me like you want to kill me? Who will feed you if I'm gone? All right. Progressive era. I want to point out that the PowerPoint that I am sharing, I'll post this when I'm done with the lectures. So, because I'm kind of using this like a chalkboard since we don't have an actual chalkboard. So when I get done going through all these lectures, I'll take this whole PowerPoint and just put it up in the Unit 1 content area, and you can download it and have all the chalkboard stuff. Immigrants. After the Civil War, about 14 million people immigrated to the United States in about the first 25 years after the war ended. And a lot of them were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe and Russia. Many of them, a relative had gone over. For these people here, chances are one of their sons or maybe two of their sons have already gone over and sort of established themselves, and then sent word back here to Ma and Pa, come on over, here's some money, we'll meet you at the dock, kind of thing. Once you arrive, now you have to go through immigration, and basically as long as you weren't sick, as long as you had some money to support yourself, you were pretty much let in the door. If you've ever watched The Godfather Part 2, the very beginning of that movie, we see Vito Corleone come to America. So this happened a lot, again, about 14 million times to be precise. Now the difference between these immigrants and older waves of immigrants is these immigrants typically did not head to the frontier. Earlier waves of immigrants usually got out away from the eastern seaboard out to where there was land, okay? We're all aware that, for instance, here in Texas, a whole bunch of Germans came over. If you've ever been up to Minnesota and Wisconsin, the Swedes and the Norwegians and all those people, right? This wave of immigration is different. A lot of these people are simply going to stay in the cities, and the cities will spring up with basically ethnic enclaves. So you'll have, Little Italy, Little Russia, Little Poland, Little Ireland, Little Estonia, all right? And so you'll have these areas where the language is spoken, the culture is there, and these people are very comfortable being there and really don't want to move out to, Haystack, Minnesota or something like that. You might have one of the sons who might decide he wants to try his luck, out further west, but not a lot, okay? Certainly not Ma and Pa here. They're probably going to stay in the city. Now, in every large city, there were what were called machines. And I'm going to get back to that first question in the study guide eventually in this section. Political machines. Okay. All the major cities have them. New York, probably the one you might be familiar with, had been the old Tammany Hall machine. Tammany was dead, his machine was still alive. They basically ran the city governments. Chicago had a pretty well lit machine. Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, et cetera, et cetera. And these political machines were very helpful for immigrants because at the time that we're talking about here, there is no social safety net. So if Paul here gets a job somewhere and gets his damn arm cut off by one of the machines, well, as the French say, la tough tete, all right? There's no worker insurance. There's no Social Security for disabled. None of that stuff exists, all right? If he's lucky, the people who own the machine that cut off his arm will throw some bucks his way, but that's it, all right? Well, that's where the machines came in, okay? The machine will probably help Paul here find some other job, okay? They'll probably, it might help him find, a tailor who can fix all of his clothes to meet his new circumstances, okay? Or these people might be living in a tenement and it burns down. Well, they don't have any clothes. They don't have any furniture. It's all gone. That's where the machines came in. All right, let me give you a quote here. And these machines ran with military precision. So you would have sort of a general over the whole thing, and then parts of the cities would belong to colonels, and then blocks within those cities would belong to majors, and then you might have a captain who's in charge of 2 or 3 buildings, and then lieutenants, and all the way down. So I'm going to read to you a quote here from someone who worked for one of these machines. If there's a fire in 9th, 10th, or 11th, anytime day or night, I'm usually there as soon as the fire engines. If a family gets burned out, I don't ask if they're Republican or Democrat. I don't refer them to the charity organizations, which will finally get around to their case after they're dead. What I do is I get them someplace to live, I get clothes for them, I get them fixed up and running. It's philanthropy, but it's also politics. Mighty good politics. Who can tell how many votes one of those fires brings me? The poor are the most grateful people in the world, and they have a lot more friends than the rich. What the machines wanted was to remember on election day who found you a new place when your old place got burned out. Who helped Paul here find another job after his arm got cut off by one of the machines? Who was it? Was it the Democrats? Was it the Republicans? I'm just saying. Who was there for you? And so these district captains, these lieutenants, birthdays, wedding anniversaries, bar mitzvahs, funerals, they were always there, okay? Somebody died, they took care of the cost of the funeral. A baby was born, guess who brought over some gifts? Someone had a birthday, someone had their 50th wedding anniversary. That's a big occasion. Guess who showed up with a couple of gifts, all right? And all that they ask in return is that when election day comes along, you remember who your friends were. Illegal? No. Unethical? We get into a gray area here. Again, there's no social safety net. None. There are private charity organizations that can take a long time, whereas the machines are there as soon as the fire engines get there. The problem with the machines is that in addition to running the social safety net, is that they also ran all of the vice, gambling, prostitution, narcotics, bribing politicians, bribing judges, and so on and so forth. So they definitely have their downside as well as their upside. And this brings us to what was the progressive era and what did it react to? Well, when we talk about the progressive era, we're generally talking from about 1900, 1920 is when we generally sort of date that time period. The progressive era was a reaction to three forces. Okay? Political corruption, industrialization, and urbanization. We kind of looked at political corruption in our little vignette here with Ma and Pa. Again, there is a social safety net that the machines run, but the machines are also pretty much running all the vice. And so, yes, Ma and Pa here are protected by the machine, but it's possible one of their daughters winds up working as a prostitute in one of the gambling halls also run by the machine. So again, really mixed results here. But we're going to see some political reform come through. Industrialization. This is, hey buddy, a city on the East Coast. I think it's Pittsburgh. Probably healthier to smoke a cigarette than to try to breathe the air there. Here's the thing about industrialization. Again, the United States did go through a massive industrialization after the Civil War, and that industrialization needed cheap labor, which is where our good friends, the immigrants, come in at. $10 hours a day, 6 days a week, 20 cents an hour for skilled labor, 10 cents an hour for unskilled labor. Safety standards were poor. Accidents were more common in the United States than in any other industrialized nation in the world. Typically, roughly 30,000 industrial accidents per year. Women and children worked. At 1900, 20% of women worked. That same year, 1900, about 2 million children worked. Basically, if you, in the year 1900, if you were a boy between the ages of 10 and 15, there was a 1 in 5 chance that you had a job. Okay. And so here we see children in a coal mine. This is an anti-child labor. Good material, goes through the workplace, comes out with no real future. And here's a child selling newspapers with possibly the dirtiest feet I've ever seen. Okay. So again, Industrialization. Clean water. Well, we'll get to urbanization in a second. In fact, let's go to the third thing, urbanization. Stop beeping at me. Urbanization. More people were living in cities. Now, at 1900, more people were not living in cities, but by 1920, that will have flipped. After 1920, there are more people living in cities than not living in cities. Most of the lower class, these workers and these immigrants, are packed into what is called tenement housing, such as this lovely example that we see here, what appears to be the kitchen of a tenement house. Forget about having filtered water. That's not going to happen. Chances are there's no running water in your apartment. There's probably a faucet somewhere on the floor that you have to go to. You're going to have 2 bathrooms for every 20 or so tenants. So you'll be sharing a bathroom with at least 19 other people. Fire escapes, maybe. And even when the fire escapes were there, they typically became blocked. Sometimes they were made out of wood. I mean, a wooden fire escape. Well, what the hell do you think is going to happen when the building catches fire? Genius. This is Jacob Reese. He wrote a book during this period. He was a photographer. Called The Shame of the Cities, in which he sort of documented these tenements. Now, this picture you're seeing was a picture taken outdoors, but it was so dark because of all of the smoke. Okay, remember this? That even though he was taking this picture in daylight, he had to use flash photography in order to get this picture. This is probably staged, but the idea of children sleeping in the streets was not a particularly uncommon one. And my neighbor's mowing the lawn, so hopefully that won't be a distraction. So again, political corruption, industrialization, and urbanization. Let me read to you from some of Jacob Reese's work. Mothers and fathers sew by day and night. Those in the home sweatshop work cheaper than those in factory workshops. And the children are called in from play to work beside their elders. All the year in New York, you may watch children radiating to and from such pitiful homes. You can see them, pallid boy or spindly girl, their faces dulled, their backs bent under a heavy load of garments piled on head and shoulders. Is it not a cruel civilization that allows little hearts and little shoulders to strain under such grown-up responsibilities? Now, what about unions? Your textbook is going to talk about labor in one of its chapters, chapter 22, a little bit of chapter 18. Sometimes unions got in and sometimes they weren't able to. In a lot of places, owners would threaten to fire everybody if a union was formed, or they would lock the doors to keep union organizers from coming into the building. This led to a tragedy in 1911. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company. A shirtwaist was something worn by men. It's kind of a girdle for men, or Spanx, I guess. You get the picture, though. The people who work there have been trying to form a union, and in order to keep the union organizers out, the doors were locked, and then a fire broke out on the eighth to 10th floor, and the ladders from the fire department wouldn't go that high. Screaming men and women, boys and girls crowded out onto the window ledges and threw themselves into the streets far below. They jumped with their clothes ablaze. The hair of some of the girls streamed behind them in flames as they leapt. Thud after thud sounded on the pavements. It is a ghastly fact that on both Green Street and Washington Place, there grew mounds of the dead and dying. From opposite windows, spectators saw again and again pitiful companionships formed in the instant of death as girls wrapped their arms around each other and leapt to the streets below. And that killed 146 people. Even tiny things could affect your health. There's no OSHA. There's no worker safety standards. None of that stuff exists in 1900. So let me tell you the story of Sally. Sally is an intelligent, neat girl who has worked from the time that she got her papers in embroidery factories. In her work, she was accustomed to using a white powder, usually chalk, which was brushed over the perforated design and thus transferred to the cloth. The design could be easily brushed off when made of chalk. All right. So you have the design on the cloth. It's there in chalk. Chalk can be easily brushed off. We don't want it to get brushed off because it's an embroidery factory. So her last employer commenced using white lead powder, which cheapened the work as the powder could not be rubbed off. None of the girls knew of the change in powder nor of the danger in its use. Sally had been a very strong girl. She began to be unable to eat. Her hands and feet swelled. She lost the use of one hand. Her teeth and gums were blue. When she finally had to stop work, she was advised to go to a hospital. There, the examination revealed the fact that she had lead poisoning. Okay? Sally was never told that she was putting her hands in lead. Okay? There was certainly no safety standards, and in fact, neither she nor her co-workers were ever told about the dangers of working with lead. The other one, if you want to read the book, The Radium Girls, radium was painted on glow-in-the-dark clocks, okay? So you can see the hands of the clock, tick, 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 and all that. Well, that has to be painted on, right? So you're dipping a paintbrush in radium, putting it on. Well, that paintbrush needs to be very sharp, okay, the end of it, in order to paint that tiny stuff. So what better way to sharpen the brush than to wet it in your mouth and sharpen it like thus. Thus, you are putting radium into your mouth because you were not told how dangerous that is by your employer. And all those radium girls died of horrible cancers. Most of them, before they died, losing their upper jaw, lower jaw, teeth, tongue, their palate. Can you imagine losing your hard palate? Holy shit, okay? Again, no safety standards. We don't even have to warn you, all right? Overall goals of the progressive movement. One, lessen the roles of special interests in formulating government policy. Well, I'm going to give them an F on that one. Two, create a more democratic political system. We'll get to that in a moment. And three, empower the federal government to intervene in society and in the economy. Okay. Let's start with creating a more democratic political system. Creating a more democratic political system. All right, so a couple of things were done as far as this. Okay. Here's an idea: voter registration. Okay. First state to require that, Oregon, 1889. Oregon required voter registration. Okay. Until then, the catchphrase was vote early, vote often. So you might vote in place A and then go back and vote in place B. Political, I misspelled this. Just get used to this. All right, political system, voter registration. Adopted in Oregon, spreads out to others. Primary elections. Okay, have the people choose who's going to run as a party candidate rather than some backroom deal. I'll give that one a mixed. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution. Okay. Providing for the direct popular election of U.S. senators. Until this amendment was passed, senators, U.S. senators, were still chosen by state legislatures. But with the 17th Amendment, the people would be voting for who their senators were. And then finally, what's called initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiative, referendum, and what's called recall. Initiative, and you've probably heard this in poli-sci already, but initiative so you get if a bunch of citizens have a good idea, like we think this would be a good idea for a law, and we want the people to vote on that law on the next ballot, we can get a petition, and you have to get X number of people. It's usually a percentage to get it. So if a bunch of people in Austin decided they wanted to have a law that cats have to be on leashes, well, if they can get 50,000 people to sign that petition, then it goes up onto the ballot the next time there's an election. Although I don't think Austin has initiative. I know San Antonio does. The referendum part citizens vote on the initiative. So if you get all these people, you get, however many how many signatures you need to get your cat leash initiative, then it actually goes out so that the people get to vote on it. And that's referendum. I can't recall, it's been a long time since I've seen a big initiative referendum. In San Antonio in the early 90s was the last big one. I think there was a golf course that was going to open, and the initiative was that the golf course would not be able to draw water from one of San Antonio's drinking water supplies. This was 30 years ago, so I'm not totally up on the details. Once they got all the signatures they needed, it then went on to referendum for the next election. Recall is where you unelect an elected official. So somebody wins the election and you think this person really sucks. You actually have to go through the initiative process and get names on the petition in order to trigger the recall. And probably the most famous successful recall of my lifetime happened when, what was his name? Gray Davis. Gray Davis, the governor of California, was recalled in California in 2003. And that is when Arnold Schwarzenegger won that election and became governor of California. I know Scott Walker up in Wisconsin, there was an attempt to recall him sometime in the last 10 years. Let's see, 2012, which was not successful. And I think the current governor of California is about to enter a recall. Yeah, Gavin Newsom is probably going to face a recall election. And again, a losing sport after quarantine. Actually, according to this latest article I'm looking at, most voters oppose recall as COVID optimism rises. Well, anyway, that's California. Clearly, we do not have recall here in Texas because we would spend all of our time having elections and recall elections because this is Texas. Right. So, again, creating a more democratic political system by, again, giving people, by making elections safer and by also giving the people more voice in their government. Our first progressive president is Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt had been elected vice president with old William McKinley in 1900, and then William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. So Roosevelt then moved up to the presidency. He is the youngest person ever to become president. John F. Kennedy is the youngest person ever elected president. Roosevelt is the youngest person to ever become president because, again, he moved up. Man, I can't even spell the word president. All right, President TR 1901-1908. There should not be an asterisk here. All right. Roosevelt will be our first sort of progressive president. He'd already been a progressive governor of New York. making some reforms to the New York political system, throwing his effort into laws to make New York State a less dangerous place to live in terms of factory conditions, safety conditions, et cetera, et cetera. But he becomes president, again, accidentally, in 1901. And what he refers to the presidency as a bully pulpit. If you have that kind of power, you can use it to bully the people who maybe need to be bullied, at least in Roosevelt's opinion, people that need to be bullied into shaping up. And his first target were corporations. Now, Roosevelt did not mind corporations as a general rule. Okay, he understood how corporations work. He understood that in many respects corporations were helpful, but his problem with corporations is when they became arrogantly stupid. His first clash over this was in the 1902 coal strike. This isn't on your study guide, but I just want to give you an idea of Roosevelt's power. Basically, the owners refused to negotiate with the union. In fact, the owners refused to even sit in the same room as the union people. That got Roosevelt pissed off. And so Roosevelt told the owners, he would have the army take over the mines, have the army extract the coal, and pay the owners nothing if they did not do a quick attitude adjustment. Roosevelt had his problems with unions as well. He typically kind of found them to be a nuisance sometimes. But he had a lot less patience for what he called the arrogant stupidity of rich people. And Roosevelt was a rich person. He came from rich people. He came from very rich people. So he had no time for their bullshit. Roosevelt is going to eventually break up 25 major monopolies, oil, tobacco, chemicals, but sometimes he was willing to cut a deal. Okay. For instance, U.S. Steel in 1904, U.S. Steel said, look, we'll let the government take a look at our accounts if you promise not to drag, and we'll straighten everything out, but please don't drag us into court. And Roosevelt went along with that. So again, if you were going to be reasonable, Roosevelt could be reasonable. But if you were abusing the public, abusing the trust of the public, as Standard Oil and American Tobacco had done, then Roosevelt was probably going to come after you. Some of the most important legislation during the Roosevelt administration revolved around food. There was no FDA, okay? And so this brings us to the story of the jungle by Upton Sinclair. This was a book written largely to promote socialism, but it wound up having graphic descriptions of Chicago meatpacking. So let's read a quote here. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from the roofs would drip onto the meat, and rats would race about on the meat. It was too dark in these storage spaces to see well, but the man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried shit of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the meat packers would put out poisoned bread for them. The rats would die, and then the rats, the poisoned bread, and the meat would all go into the mixer together. Num, num. Meat Inspection Act 1906, the first attempt by the federal government to inspect what people were putting into their bellies. All right. Again, there was no meat, there was no food inspection at all before this. The second thing had to do with what we call over-the-counter drugs, but back then were called patent medicines. And this all started with Collier's. In 1905, this magazine, Collier's, began investigating, again, what were called patent medicines, what we today would call over-the-counter medicines. Medicines, what we would now, that should be counter, over-the-counter medications. And Collier found a lot of drugs and alcohol. Hood's sarsaparilla, you don't need to know these names, 18% alcohol content. Payne's celery compound, 21% alcohol content. Hostetter's bitters, 44% alcohol content. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for children who are teething. Heroin in that one, and another one called Cop's Baby's Friend also had heroin. That killed 9 babies in a single year. Ooh, cocaine tooth drops. All right. So out of this came the first in several Pure Food and Drug Acts. The first one's in 1906. They're going to have to amend it over and over and over again. What did the Pure Drug Act do? It basically said, ingredients. You had to put the ingredients on the label. When people are taking heroin, they want to know how much heroin they're taking. Okay? When people are giving cocaine to their children, they want to know how much cocaine they're giving. So now you have to tell them. Again, this is going to be amended several times. It's going to go after false advertising next. Wizard oil is probably just alcohol. This is definitely alcohol. This is clearly alcohol. I don't know what the hell is going on here. But again, going after alcohol. Plasters probably don't have alcohol in them. They probably, though, were claiming that they could cure all sorts of stuff. Here's some false advertising. Microbe Killer. Now, Microbe Killer came from Texas. And according to its inventor, Microbe Killer, could cure headaches, worms, measles, malaria, tuberculosis, yellow fever, smallpox, and leprosy. Right. Tonic, that's alcohol. Extract, that's probably alcohol. These are all alcohol or heroin. I mean, that's the basic ingredient here that we're talking about here. The other thing they eventually had to go after were medical devices, because when electricity came along, people started building medical devices. The magnetic belt, which men would wear, which would restore vital power to their genitals. One guy claimed that he could cure syphilis. He would have you sit in a toilet that was filled with water. Okay, so your genital parts are sort of in the water, and the toilet's hooked up to a car battery. All right, so yeah. This also applied to food. For a while there, grape nuts claimed that it could cure appendicitis. So there we go. That is the Pure Food and Drug Act. Again, it's going to be amended several times to cover both medicine and food. Probably the story about food that I remember the most is they were putting, you have canned vegetables, like green beans and stuff like that. Well, when they shipped them to the north, the vegetables would, there's water in the canned vegetables. The water would freeze in the can. And so one manufacturer decided the best way to deal with this was to put antifreeze in with the green beans. Okay. That killed some people. Okay. So again, these attempts, steps that the government is taking to prevent foods and drugs from killing people. I don't know what female complaints are, and I don't want to know what they are. Probably has to do with menstruation, because 16 years of menopause seems kind of excessive. So menstruation. We're going to skip William Howard Taft. I'm not going to go through every president that we've had, but Taft comes along after Roosevelt. I'm just going to extend the time here. Okay. But after Taft, Woodrow Wilson comes in as a Democrat. And there's a couple of things that happen in Woodrow Wilson's administration. Here's Wilson. He'll be involved in World War I. We'll get to that in a second. The 16th Amendment is part of Wilson's administration. The 16th Amendment is the one on income tax. An income tax, the United States paid most of its bills with import taxes. Import taxes were 40–50%. So that typically was how we made our money. Well, the Underwood tariff and the tariff is what we call an import tax. Lower the import tax to 30%. And increase the items that are on the tariff-free list, items you don't have to pay import tax on. Well, that's all great and dandy, but those import taxes were how we pay our bills. So how are we going to pay our bills? And that is where the 16th Amendment comes in. Okay, the income tax which may predate Wilson. I think it's 1912. So it actually predates Woodrow Wilson. I think William Howard Taft would have been the first president where we operated under the income tax. Two other areas, I'm not going to talk about that. I want to talk about women's suffrage and prohibition. Make sure I got everything. There's a name, Samuel Adams. Let me go back up here. Okay, if you're looking at the study guide, you're seeing the name Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams was the one who wrote the articles about over-the-counter medications. All right, let me get back to women's suffrage and prohibition. Okay, what is women's suffrage? Okay, it is women wanting the right to vote, and it is a classic example of progressivism, because what's going to happen is it's going to start local, then move its way to the state, and then eventually national. Okay, so that's classic progressivism. It's women winning the right to vote at the local level or the county level, then going up to the state level, and then eventually getting all the way up to where women win the right to vote at the national level. The first state to allow women to vote was Wyoming. In 1869, Wyoming allowed women to vote, and that was followed by other Western states, Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, places like that. Why did Western states allow women to vote? Because Western states were trying to attract women settlers. Why? Women have a civilizing influence over men. This was the thinking here. Okay, and so if the Western states wanted their men to become civilized, they needed to attract some women. And a good way to attract women was to allow them to vote. So it's a lot of the Western states are the ones who allow women to start voting. As women became more involved in politics, they gained experience. Women are very much in the forefront of the labor union movement and in the children's movement. And in those movements, women learned how to agitate, how to politic, how to put on demonstrations. So they took those tools that they learned and they brought them over and applied them to their own situation. Okay, women had learned a lot in the farm movement, the labor, the children's movement, the Grange, all these other issues that women had worked in. They could take the tools that they learned and move that over to issues that they were interested in, which is women voting. The sign says New York State allows criminals and idiots to vote, and I think lunatics is the other word here. I'd have to blow it up. Every year, women march down Broadway in New York City demanding the right to vote. These crowds got bigger every year. They held some kind of kick-ass pageant here at the Treasury Building in Washington, D.C. That I am really sad no film footage of this exists because it looks awesome. And they picketed outside the White House. Now, initially, Woodrow Wilson was not in favor of women voting. What changed his mind about women and the right to vote is women's work in the war effort. And again, the whole thing was moving eastwards anyway. Illinois, New York, Arkansas, Pennsylvania. So the movement had spread from just being out west. It had crossed back to the east. But in terms of women's work in the war effort, women were working in factories, making clothes, the Red Cross, all that stuff that women did in World War I, sell war bonds, led Wilson to change his mind about whether or not women should be allowed to vote. And eventually, remember I said this goes from local to state to national, we get the 19th Amendment, which allows women to vote. Okay. Prohibition, which is the anti-liquor movement, again, moved in the same direction. Local, state, and then eventually national. Okay. Prohibition had started largely in the West. It had started at city levels. And you got to understand, people drank a lot at the beginning of the 20th century. Again, in a lot of places, the water might kill you, so it was probably safer to have a beer or whiskey or something. Here's some anti-prohibition. Woo-wee. So we start seeing it largely out west in cities, then it spreads to the south. In fact, by 1916, 23 states had gone dry. There were 23 states, most in the South and the West, where you could not purchase alcoholic beverages anywhere. Once again, the war sort of added to the impulse because two reasons. How does the war speed up prohibition? One, grain for beer. The grain for making beers needed to feed our allies. And I know people today who will not drink beer because they feel that the grain and the oats could be better used to feed hungry people. Second, many of the brewers had German names and German origins. Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, Pabst. Okay. So this sort of hysteria about all things German, which we'll look at when we get to World War I, but there's a lot of anti-German hysteria in this country after World War I starts. We'll get there. And the fact that we need the grain to feed the Allies in the war speeds up the push for prohibition. So the 18th Amendment outlaws the manufacture, importation, or selling of sweet, delicious booze in the U.S. Okay. And again, local, state, national. Classic example of a progressive idea moving its way up. Same thing with women voting. All right, this ends the lecture over the progressive era. As always, if you have questions, you can contact me during office hours or send me an email or set up a meeting for some other time. Our next lecture, we will start going overseas and looking at American foreign policy after the Civil War. And that will lead us directly into World War I. Alrighty, where is stop recording? All right, have a pleasant evening.